Good morning. This is Jackie, and I am going to walk you through a review of Everett Rogers' Adoption and Diffusion of Innovation this morning. The reason we'll be reviewing this material is because it is critical to understanding the important adaptation to this theory in order to segment markets for high-tech products. This adaptation is called Crossing the Chasm, and we'll be covering Crossing the Chasm during class. So in order to really get the most out of that, I want you to make sure that you're up to speed on Everett Rogers' classic theory, Adoption and Diffusion of Innovation. The adoption and diffusion of innovation is a mouthful, and in other domains that I work with, for instance, in ecological restoration or other fields outside of business, oftentimes people just refer to this idea of how quickly a new innovation will spread through a marketplace is referred to as either takeoff or scale up. And I think that's much easier to say, and it's much more intuitive in terms of what we're talking about. Importantly, how quickly this innovation spreads through the market depends on two critical factors. First of all, how people talk to each other. In marketing, we call this word of mouth relationships. And we're going to come back and revisit the importance of these word of mouth relationships in our adaptation to this classic theory for high tech. In addition, this diffusion also depends heavily on the firm's efforts in advertising, publicity, digital media, public relations. All of these marketing communications efforts are designed to inform and educate possible customers about the new innovation, with the realization that customers can't buy things if they're unaware of them. So these are two foundational factors that affect how quickly this innovation takes off or scales up. Everett Rogers' model has 5 factors that affect the customer purchase decision. And each of these factors also affects how quickly the idea or innovation will take off. The first factor is known as relative advantage, and these are from the customer's perspective. What are the customer's perceptions of the benefits of buying and owning using the new innovation compared to the costs of adopting that innovation? And the costs of adopting this innovation include both the monetary costs as well as switching costs, anxiety, uncertainty, psychosocial risks, and all of these benefits and costs are viewed not in terms of the innovation itself, but in relation to the status quo, which are the other alternatives that this customer may have available for that same purpose. So when we look at the way people are trying to rely on new technologies like Zoom during COVID, using collaborative team platforms such as Slack or Microsoft Teams, the whole idea is we already have been teaching face-to-face. We already have been collaborating without using these software platforms. And so how much effort is entailed in using those things relative to the new benefits that we're receiving. Compatibility refers to the extent to which this new innovation is compatible or consistent with existing ways of doing things and our standard cultural norms. So obviously it's been very difficult to switch to Zoom teaching and online because we are so used to being in the classroom together. This new way of teaching, it might not offer the same benefits, but it's also inconsistent or incompatible with what we expect and what we're used to doing. Now, it's interesting that compatibility is based on what we expect, how things should be done, but it can also be based on cultural norms, and those do vary by society. With respect to complexity, I have an asterisk here and I'll explain this shortly. Complexity refers to how hard a customer will find it to use the new technology. And in this particular case, this ease of use factor is so critically important that I wanted to spend a minute talking about how companies set expectations for complexity. When we hear companies use words like, my software is so intuitive, or you'll learn to use this very fluidly, it sets the expectation for customers that it will be easy to use. And if in fact those customers don't find that to be true, they make a personal attribution, which is, I must be an idiot. In fact, most high-tech companies design the products that they offer, and as a result, they seem intuitive to them. But this is where user testing and user experience is so important, because what engineers and developers quickly find out is, according to mainstream customers, not innovators, not early adopters, but early majority and late majority, technology is just more difficult for some people to grasp. And so you cannot set expectations about ease of use. It's much better to say, it may take you a couple hours of training to feel totally comfortable with this. And then a customer says, okay, I'm willing to make that investment in a couple hours of training. And then you get the uptake that you're expecting. Trial ability is kind of a made-up word by marketing people, and it essentially means how easy is it to try a new innovation before you buy. In some cases, this can be fairly straightforward. For example, you can give customers a 30-day free trial of a software package. You can offer them some sort of a freemium business model. With subscriptions, you can offer them, a money-back guarantee. But for many B2B installations of technology, unless you deploy the software broadly throughout an organization, for instance, artificial intelligence, it's really difficult to try a very complicated tech installation because you can't see the benefits unless it's fully deployed. Artificial intelligence algorithms can't work unless it has lots of your organization's data to work on to refine its recommendations. So you'll see that trialability is important because it gives customers a sense of how to gauge those benefits that we're talking about in relative advantage. Trialability also helps customers assess, is it complex, hard to use? Is it compatible with the way I'm used to doing things, or is it going to require that I totally transform my workflow? So trialability is important, but it's not a surefire solution for all types of technologies. I'll just take a moment to talk about trialability for electric vehicles. People can go test drive an electric vehicle, and the data show that most customers are just really delighted with the performance and handling and how quiet they are. However, a test drive doesn't allow a customer to really get the familiarity that they need with how do they feel when their battery range drops below 20%. And they don't know where the charging stations are, and they don't know how long it will take to charge. And so in some cases, trialability needs to be a long enough period of time that customers really understand the full experience and not just the tip of the iceberg. I'm going to drop down to observability, because observability is the fifth factor in Everett Rogers' model. And this is the extent to which those benefits that we're talking about in relative advantage are visible, not only to me, the user, but to anyone who might be watching me use a new product. So clearly, when people use new technologies in public, for example, when we're using wireless earpods, when we're using smartphones, those are highly visible in public. But for many technologies that are used in more narrow applications, the only people who understand the benefits that a user receives from that are the people who are actually involved in the usage. So in terms of observability, this can help a new innovation take off, because when people can see others using it, then they can go evaluate it. But to the extent that new innovations are not publicly observable, then it can actually delay that takeoff or make the takeoff take longer. Okay, this factor, ability to communicate product benefits, is one that we've added for technology, because we find a mismatch between the way tech companies tend to talk about the technological features of the new innovations they're bringing to market, and translating those features such as megahertz or processing speed into the actual benefits that users get. And we're going to come back to this later, because features are not the same as benefits. The benefits relate to the problems that a user is trying to solve. And the technical specifications of a product oftentimes can deliver those features, but there's this mismatch in communicating, again, from the developer's side to the customer side. So we're going to focus on crafting value propositions that communicate in customers' terms these benefits. All of these factors affect the degree to which the new innovation will scale up rapidly in a market. One of the things that I really encourage companies to do is to make a chart of how each of these factors will either inhibit scale up, or what they can do to actually overcome that factor if it's not positively viewed by customers, in order to remove it as a barrier. I'm going to take a quick pause here for just a minute to check in on my timing. Okay, so we'll continue on with this review information on the adoption and diffusion of innovation. And what we'll be moving into now is the categories of adopters that essentially equate to market segments for purposes of adoption and diffusion of innovation. Again, based on a review, students of business and marketing should be very familiar with the normal bell-shaped curve that includes 5 categories of adopters. And as you see here, these categories are created based on how likely it is that the customers in that segment are likely to adopt a new innovation or technology, and how quickly they'll adopt something new. And the important point here is that different marketing strategies are required to appeal to each of these different categories. So the marketing that works for innovators, for example, is not the same as the marketing that would work for an early majority group of customers, because each group has different buying motivations, different consumer behavior. So we will go through each of these categories of adopters to understand what their buying motivations are. And this is critically important to understanding this adaptation for technology markets in terms of how to cross the chasm. And I've defined the chasm in the high-tech marketing class previously. Our first category of adopters in the classic theory are referred to as innovators. And this is really important to understand that innovators are the customers who adopt first. They are not the inventors of the product. The product is made by a company and it's sold to customers, and customers who adopt first are highly innovative, and as a result, they are referred to as innovators. Jeffrey Moore refers to them as technology enthusiasts. Sometimes affectionately, we'll hear them referred to as gadget freaks, geeks. These will be the people who will stand in line overnight to be the first to buy the next generation of a new gaming console or a new version of an iPhone, for example. That used to be the case. It's less so now with COVID and online ordering. Importantly, these innovators are just a small part of the market, 2.5%. But you'll see on this last bullet that they're really important because they are the gatekeepers to the next group of adopters. And if innovators don't like the new product or technology, or they pan it or give it bad reviews, then it's unlikely to make it much further than that. Excuse me 1 second while I check and see what my cat, okay, good. I thought he's been bringing in little critters lately for us, which has not been very pleasant. We had a baby rabbit in the house this morning. Okay, why do innovators find such enthusiasm for new things? First of all, they get personal gratification by saying, yes, I was one of the first people who bought this. I was one of the first people who used it. And they love to work with technical personnel in the alpha testing, which is testing the first iteration that comes out. This might be the equivalent of a stage 1 clinical trial, for example, but applied to tech, or beta testing, which is when equivalent would be maybe a stage 3 clinical trial where the company's trying to get more data on how well the technical performance of the product works. And so these technology enthusiasts have a strong orientation to understanding technology. It's why they're gadget freaks. These might be people who like to build their own 3D printers in their garage or make their own motherboards for their computers. And because they're so technical, they're very tolerant if this new technology has some initial glitches. And in this sense, although they're an important gatekeeper, they're definitely not typical customers. And when a high-tech company is successful in selling to these innovators, they get really excited and jazzed up because the innovators talk their language. And they get this false sense of how awesome their new innovation is without realizing that this is not going to be their typical experience. That takes us to the second category of adopters. Early adopters are called early because on our normal bell-shaped curve, early adopters adopt before the mean time of adoption, where mean is the rest of the market. And this group comprises 13.5% of the market. And in Jeffrey Moore's adaptation, he refers to these early adopters as visionaries. And when you think about what is a visionary is somebody who's looking into the future and trying to reimagine a new future and what that could look like. And as a result of this visionary perspective, you'll see that they're attracted to invest in high-risk, high-reward innovations that will revolutionize the way they run their business, and that's going to transform their industry. So when we think about technology, these would be the companies like Amazon, for example, who when Jeff Bezos came in, I don't know, in the late 1990s, and he was building this huge mega distribution center in Nevada, people thought he was crazy that he was going to be saddled with these fixed costs that made no sense whatsoever. But he invested in technology because clearly he's disrupted retail as we know it. People who are early adopters or businesses are not necessarily price sensitive, and that's why they're willing to bet big and invest in technology. But the flip side of that is from a technology vendor's perspective, these customers are very demanding and they expect customized solutions for their needs and intensive tech support. The next category of adopters are called the early majority. And in our normal bell-shaped curve, they comprise 34% of the market. So right away on a relative basis, where the percentage of the market essentially equates to the revenue potential, this group is really important. And Jeffrey Moore refers to them as pragmatists. They're very pragmatic and practical. And you see this reflected in their buying motivations. They're comfortable purchasing new technologies in order to make evolutionary changes in their business. They are not trying to disrupt things. They just want to save costs. They just want to grow revenue incrementally using their same business models. And they don't want to disrupt their own operations. And as a result, when they invest in technology, they have to be assured that when they invest it in their business, it won't be something that shuts down their distribution center or causes problems with their IT infrastructure. They need proven applications with reliable service and results. And you could imagine how important this is, because when we're working in Zoom, for example, anytime that Zoom goes out, which we did have a couple outages early on, because when we all went remote due to COVID, if we couldn't be on Zoom, we couldn't deliver our classes. So we as an institution needed these proven applications with reliable service. Importantly, in terms of how the word of mouth relationships work here, is in order to really encourage these mainstream customers to buy, they need a word of mouth recommendation from trusted colleagues who work in the same industry. So what are other universities doing, for example? They're looking to learn from others as opposed to being willing to pioneer something on their own. And note that visionaries, customers who are viewed as pioneering, are not a credible reference. And we'll see this later, that these visionaries are really viewed as kind of scary and threatening by these pragmatists. So they don't want to listen to what visionaries have to say in terms of recommendations. By the way, I did go over this idea of a catch-22 in class. The next category of adopters are called the late majority, meaning they fall after the mean time of adoption. There are some tautological problems with the logic here that I'm not going to go into. The late majority are referred to as conservatives, and collectively, the early majority and the late majority are 68% of the market. So this is referred to as the mainstream market, the early majority and the late majority. So you see that first bullet, late majority conservatives are the other half of this mainstream market. By their name, Jeffrey Moore refers to them as conservatives. This does not refer to political leaning. It refers to their propensity to adopt innovation. They are risk averse and technology shy, and they are very price sensitive. I'm sorry, I have a typo here. When they're ready to buy, they need multiple vendors, multiple solutions that are available in the marketplace. And what this means is that it gives them a sense of security knowing that there are multiple product options to choose from. And in this particular case, while the prior group didn't want to disrupt their operations, this group is looking for completely dummy-proof, pre-assembled, bulletproof solutions that come fully packaged, so all they really need to do is push a button and it's up and running. And when they buy, they're not necessarily trying to save on costs or increase their revenue or profitability. They're just trying to keep up with their competitors. And they are the ones who might rely on a single trusted advisor to make recommendations. And oftentimes these trusted advisors could be, for instance, their accountants who are helping them understand what technologies they need to make their businesses efficient. Okay, the next category is the last category, and these are known as laggards in the language of Everett Rogers, and Jeffrey Moore refers to them as skeptics. They represent 16% of the market, so this is still a sizable segment. And these folks view any innovation as a hindrance. They are the ones who like to keep doing things the old-fashioned way. And they are sometimes referred to as Luddites. And if you're interested in the lexicon, Luddites were a group of people in the 1500s and 1600s in Britain who didn't want the knitting looms, the weaving looms to be used, and they burned them. And this is where the word Luddite came from in terms of referring to people who just are not at all comfortable using technology. And they are only willing to buy if they're forced to in order to keep up. So you might think of people who finally, bought a cell phone, maybe your grandparents, and then they just want a simple, push button phone or something like this that's really easy. Okay, I'll go ahead and stop here with my review of the adoption and diffusion of innovation, because what you'll see is we went into crossing the chasm then in class. So this should get you up to speed with what you need to know to really understand how these categories of adopters work and what the classic adoption and diffusion of innovation model is.